So my name is Emma Hayes Johnson, and my colleague here.
I'm Celaya Kirchner. I play the violin.
And I play the cello. And usually Celaya and I collaborate on a different kind of level. We play chamber music together. So we have a piano trio, and we do a lot of performances together. We run our own concert series together. We both teach private lessons. I teach at M Institute for the Arts, and while I'm on that topic, thank you so much for M Institute for hosting us. So if you do you want to start, Celaya?
Yeah, just a couple recommendations for viewing the webinar. We have everyone on mute so that people don't talk over each other. And if we, we're gonna have the chat window open for questions. We'll try to get to them as quickly as we can. We'll address them if it's really, really important.
Sorry.
Hello, there's a dog.
Yeah.
If not, we'll just save it for the end with some questions. I'm probably going to be listening to the recordings that we're going to play with headphones. I just recommend that. There's something happening with my speakers, so I'm not doing that this week. So anyways, we can go to the next slide.
So last week we talked about the medieval and Renaissance eras, and then this week we are talking about the Baroque era. So there are some major historical events that were happening during this time, and then some important composers. So Celaya, if you want to talk a little bit about the historical events.
Yeah, so the time period we're talking about is 1600 to 1750. The biggest thing that happened was the spread of colonialism. The big powers in Europe decided that they wanted to conquer everything and take everything from Asia, from North America, South America, Africa. And with that, it created this culture of internationalism where people just were traveling all the time and mixing with other people. So there was a lot more communication between not just Europe and Asia, but also within the countries. So France and Italy were able to share cultures and things like that. They also took things, we'll talk about a couple things that took things from other cultures, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, we discovered the New World, or we colonized the New World in this century, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, and science, sorry. That was the other thing. I was like, there's another thing you gotta talk about. So science became really important. Hi, I've been science. Science became really, really important. We weren't just looking to things as we weren't just looking to God to explain things. We were being scientific about things. Francis Bacon came up with the scientific method. We were learning things about our own bodies, Isaac Newton and gravity. These kind of very hardcore scientific discoveries happened during this time period.
Yeah, and then we also have some really important composers that were very, prominent during this time. Some of the ones that you might recognize are Vivaldi and Bach, maybe Handel. And a lot of these composers kind of really set the style for what was to come after this. So many composers will say, even afterwards in the classical and romantic eras, that they were really inspired by the music of Bach. And this became a fundamental time where people really started developing kind of music theory and composition, and really paying attention to form and certain harmony and that kind of stuff, which we'll go into more detail later. But this is really important for this time period, and it really spurred everything that was to come afterwards. Okay, and we have some going along with some inventions and discoveries just to get an idea of what else was going on at this time. We have science, like Celaya was saying. Dr. William Harvey explains the circulatory system. Sir Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation was published. There's the discovery of the speed of light. We have the first telescope, steam engines, calculators, ice cream. really important for music history. And but one of the more important things on this page is Stradivarius's and other instruments. So the developments that happened in the instruments themselves were really, really important to the development of the different genres and how composers were able to make music for musicians to play. So we're going to go into that a little bit more detail in just a moment here. Okay, so we have going into that string instrument, some of the things that were different about string instruments during that time were, for example, the actual strings that were used were made out of gut, out of that material, which is much different than today, where they're made out of different kinds of metals and wound in different ways. So this changes the tone that you would hear from the instrument. The bows that were used, you can kind of see on the right-hand side of the screen, that those kind of changed over time, and that really made a difference in the way that we were able to sustain notes as it became more modernized. This also kind of is what gave us the stylistic elements that we see today. So a lot of Baroque music we'll hear is not quite as connected with like bow strokes and things when we're talking about string instruments as maybe, you know, by the time you get to the Romantic era and things. So there's definitely a style to this period that you'll hear as we play some of these video clips. As for other instruments, our woodwind instruments were all made of wood. Last week we were talking about how there were some instruments that were the loud instruments that would be outdoor instruments, but now we're allowing them to come inside. Welcome, brass and percussion. They are now in the orchestras. And the keyboard instruments that we have at this time are the harpsichord, which is super important and plays, you know, a really big role in this music that we're going to hear. And we'll hear some of the videos have the harpsichord in it as well. Okay, so moving on, we have some art here. We have three main types of art, but just sometimes the visual will kind of help us also when we're listening to the oral part of the art. So you can kind of see this religious grandeur. So we have extravagant, melodramatic qualities. We start to see greater realism, so more lifelike images. We have easel art, which starts to incorporate nature, landscapes, things like that. And if you'll notice here, we have the girl with the pearl earrings, so, or the pearl earring. Celaya's going to talk a little bit about that in our next slide.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay, Emma?
Yeah.
Then I put in my headphones. Okay, so some big differences between the Renaissance and Baroque is that we are now allowed to express emotions. So what we're going to hear a lot in the music is going to be things that are very expressive. We're also going to hear a lot of drama, so things that are very lighthearted, things that are very sad, things that are really loud, things that are really soft, things that have a lot of voices, things that don't have a lot of voices. So what they wanted to see was the drama of the contrast. And I just wanted to show, last week we showed two different statues of David. We showed the one from the early Renaissance and then from the later Renaissance. And those were pretty like just thinking about what the form of the human body looked like. But now we're looking at this David, which is from the Baroque era, which is not just focusing on what the human body looks like, but what the human body feels like, what it looks like when it moves, what all those kind of things, because this one's actually in motion this time. He has an expression on his face. We can also look at the other Bernini sculpture up here, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. She has this really, I don't know, I always learned that it was like a really erotic expression on her face, which is not something we ever see in the Renaissance or medieval eras. And then the two other really important things that happen in the Baroque time period is that the explosion of instrumental music. So what Emma was saying was that with the new toys, composers went crazy and started developing different genres of instrumental music. With that, there's just so much more that they were able to do than just with like the voice and, you know, just accompanimental instrumentals like before. And then the development of tonality, just we'll talk about tonality later. I'm not going to define it now, but the two terms that are important to know right now is basso continuo, which is basically just the bass line in any sort of piece. It lays down the harmonic framework, just like the foundation. In like a rock band, it'd be like the bass guitar. And then counterpoint, which is just this era's version of polyphony.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. And here comes opera. So this was when opera was invented, which is super interesting.
Yeah, just for the structure of this webinar, we're going to do it first by country or region, chronologically, and then move on to the next one. Italy is where a lot of this started, or where it became popular, or where it exploded. So that's definitely where we're going to start first. So Italians love their opera. I think we all know and knew that. And it originated in like the first opera was performed in 1600. And it kind of stems from a lot of different forms, but most notably probably is like the 16th century madrigals, which were really expressive. They were really dramatic, and just going from expression and drama going to operas, just like a natural transition. They took a lot of cues from Greek tragedies. So there's choruses, they're really, I keep saying dramatic, but there's no other word to like describe, I don't know of any other word to describe some of these like storylines. You know, opera storylines are crazy. Crazy.
You want me to play a little clip?
Yeah, here's the aria from Orfeo. Oh.
Okay. All right. Next slide.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about it. So yeah, that's from Orfeo, which is like the most important, like first opera. This next clip is also from Orfeo.
Okay. And just before we play this next clip, there's a couple of different styles of movements that we see in opera and we hear. So you have the aria, which is what we just heard, which is a lyrical melody over continuo, and then the recitative, which is more freely, it's like speech, very speech-like. So there's not really a strict kind of pulse, but it's actually meant to sound more spoken, but with some music accompanying. So we're going to listen to a little bit of that here. I'm going to clip to this. Yeah, you kind of hear how that's a little bit more speech-like, more spoken. Okay, and then off of the aria, we have what we call a da capo aria, which is basically a structure that became really important as far as the form and the theory that we're going to kind of continue to discuss throughout this presentation. So In a da capo aria, basically you have an A section, which is, you know, one kind of material, and then you have a contrasting B section, which will probably sound, you know, related to the earlier material somehow, but it'll be different content, and then you'll have the A section that comes back, so the original material. So that's kind of where we start to see form taking place. Okay, and then we have some vocal chamber music.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about two kinds of cantatas in this presentation. In Italy, it's going to be secular, and it's going to be with solo voice and continuo. Barbara Strozzi is the most important cantata composer. And drawing from the 16th century madrigal, cantatas also are meant to express texts and images, and they're like modes of transportation for expressing your emotions. So if you want to play the clip, Emma, let's see if it wants to cooperate. Oh, it does. Yeah, what to listen for is how expressive and the voice is. Yeah, so like the aim in something like that is not to, you know, it's not like literature where like the words are, I mean, the words are important, but that's not the aim. The aim is to create a mood, is to express a particular emotion, not like, tell you the Latin text of the Bible. Like we're way far away from wanting to hammer home like specific things. The whole aim is to express emotions.
All right, so now going back to this idea of instrumental music, I read a quote, and I can't remember exactly what it said, but it said something to the effect of the instruments were liberated from this idea of being more accompanimental, but now there's all these genres that kind of play towards emphasizing a certain instrument. So a lot of these forms and genres that we'll talk about here, once again, music theory is really important for the way that things were composed for the instruments and the different textures that we'll hear. Examples are like the cello Bach suites were for solo cello, for unaccompanied cello. And you hadn't heard any music like that before, because usually the role of the cello would be to act as an accompanimental figure or a bass line, very supportive role. But now you have these instruments stepping up into soloistic roles, which really change the repertoire. So some of these forms that you'll see are fugues. So a fugue is a compositional technique of continuously imitating a theme. And we have toccatas, which are very improvisatory. If you think about the kinds of styles that are improvisatory that we listen to today that you might come across, like jazz, maybe might come to mind. A lot of jazz artists will say, yeah, I mean, if you look back at the Baroque era, that's kind of where it all started. Improvisatory just means that instead of having every single thing written down for you, basically the composer would give you kind of an outline, and then you would kind of play around with those ideas and add your own elements to that. So that's like toccatas. Canzonas, imitative works. So once again, we're seeing that word imitative. So there's so much imitation that happens and repetition. So chaconne and passacaglia, you'll have those bass lines that are repeated throughout the whole piece. So these kinds of things are really important elements to this style of music as well. So much just repeated material and imitative kind of things. And our brain really likes to hear those things imitated, because if you hear something once, the likelihood of you remembering it later is way less likely. But if you hear something over and over again, that's when stuff starts to get really stuck in your head too. So it's kind of genius in that way. And then we also have the suite, which is the collection of 2 or more dances. So moving on, now we have the sonata.
So the sonata, coming from Italian for sonare, used to just mean any sort of instrumental piece. But now it means it meant a kind of canzona, but now people just decided, oh, it was really cool. It's just gonna be really, really popular. And there's 2 kinds of sonatas. There's the chamber sonata, which were all dance-like movements. So again, if you think of the cello suites, if you think of the violin partitas from Bach, those are all going to be chamber sonatas. You know, they have movements like jig, they have movements like courants, allemans, things like that. And those were okay to be performed outside the church. And in the church, sonatas that were from like abstract movements. So it's just going to be with titles like allegro or fugue, things like that were more serious. And I just wrote down, since I'm a violinist, the earliest sonata for solo sonata and continuo, or solo violin and continuo, is by Marini. Yeah. Anyways, go ahead and play. This one's from Vivaldi. This is for cello.
And you'll hear a little bit of, in the background, it might be harder to hear, but there's a harpsichord playing as well. Oh, slides keep doing that to me. So you can hear that harpsichord. Okay. All right.
So the most popular form of sonata was called a trio sonata. Exactly what it sounds like. There are 2 treble instruments, so that would be things like 2 violins, or like a violin and a recorder, 2 recorders, and then some sort of continuo, like low instrument, like a cello or harpsichord, things like that. And just, it gave the composer like things to, like an interesting texture to play with. Like one of the treble lines could be higher, then the other treble line could be a little bit middle, and the continuo would be at the bottom, and they could switch and things like that. It was just a lot more fun to play with. And a natural extension of this is what's called a concerto grosso, which would be a small ensemble, and then there would be like a backup larger ensemble, and the small ensemble would have solo parts, and then the larger ensemble would have accompanimental things to support the solo. And you know, a big composer of both the trio sonatas and concerto grosso was Corelli, who only composed instrumental music, which is not something we've seen yet. Most people compose things for the church. They compose things for, you know, people to sing. This is really a true sign of like, we are into instrumental music. It is a valid form of music and people really like it. But in this clip, we're gonna listen to a good amount of this clip. So some things to listen for. So first of all, that's a really interesting looking instrument. We haven't seen one of those before. That's is that like the thrembo? I can never remember how to pronounce it. But something that Corelli, Theorbo. Thanks, Ivan. There's too many vowels. But what Corelli helped to really hammer home is this idea of alternating movements. So slow, fast, slow, fast, slow, fast, whatever with the movements. And it helps to create that drama, that contrast. Something else we want to listen for is suspensions in the higher instruments. That kind of creates a tension. It always sounds kind of like this, or like you're pulling something, and then when the suspension ends, it releases. That's something to listen for. And also you get to look at the instruments, which is pretty cool. So yeah.
Okay.
Did anyone else hear how important the cellos were during that? The violins were just sitting on top doing suspension-y things, and the cellos are really just like bum, 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 bum.
Rocking out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then another thing to kind of point out, they weren't using vibrato. So a lot of the time, especially once you start getting to classical era, and then especially romantic era, string players will use vibrato. So that's a technique with your left hand to kind of add more expression. But that really hadn't been developed too much at this point. So one of the things I was talking about, stylistically, there are a lot of sounds here that make this sound a lot different from classical and romantic era music. And one of those things is this element of vibrato is lacking here. But it's still like so beautiful and has all these, awesome harmonies. So it's kind of interesting. Okay. So now moving on to the red-headed violinist, Antonio Vivaldi. So Antonio Vivaldi was really known for writing a lot of concertos, which are works for solo instruments that have larger ensembles to accompany. Sometimes so ritornello form would be more of the soloist and the orchestra kind of doing a lot of back and forth. And then we have this idea of form where we have a 3-movement structure. So kind of going along with a similar thing here that Celaya was saying, there's this dramatic difference between, you want to go from slow, fast, slow, or very active to very all of a sudden, like the one that we just watched was very still at first, and then all of a sudden everything just broke loose. So this 3-movement structure, a lot of the time that we'll see in a concerto will be a fast movement, which might be more virtuosic, slow movement, and then another fast movement. And then we start seeing more ranges of rhythms and colors. By colors, we mean not just it's not like red and blue and orange, but different kinds of characters. And so you described it well before. You were saying like a violinist would sound like wind, or a cello sounding like thunder. So the other part, this other thing that Vivaldi did that we'll see in other compositions as well is what we call program music. So in instrumental music, we don't have any lyrics to kind of help us tell the story. But in instrumental music, we just kind of have to rely more on our imagination. Just like operas, we have costuming, we have lyrics, we have a lot of visual that's kind of helping us understand what's going on. But program music is music that's written in a way to try to really evoke certain kinds of emotions or feelings or characters with the way that the music is written. So we'll play a little bit of Winter from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. You might have heard of Vivaldi's Four Seasons before, but it's each season has a very special character that is very representative of what kinds of things you think of when you think of spring. So spring, you might hear birds chirping and bubbling brooks, and winter, you might hear something a little bit more cold. Or, so let's play a little bit of that. Oh, it's always happening. Okay, so that's a little example, but you can see how the violinist is really the prima donna here. And the orchestra in the background is really meant to, help accompany that kind of character and texture. Okay, so now we're in France.
Going to France. It's specifically at the court of Louis XIV. He decided that he wanted to control everyone and anything. So he would have his aristocrats come and hang out at Versailles, and he'd be like, we can only listen to this kind of music. We can only dance these kind of dances. We can only wear these kind of clothes made by this person. And it sounds really restrictive and really sad, but it allowed France to develop an incredibly centralized like art and culture. So it's just everything was exactly the same. Everything was very, very, very French. And we were able to get a lot of ensembles. Our modern orchestras are based off of the ensembles that he established, or his friends. I think it was mostly, he had a really good team behind him coming up with these things, because there's no way he could have come up with all of these things. Social dancing became really, really important, not just because it was fun, because dancing is really fun, but also because it helped reinforce social hierarchy. Like, I'm a better aristocrat than you, I'm a better king than you, whatever, based off of your role in the dance. And this is just pictures of Versailles. And if you want to look at, we're going to talk about ornaments later, but if you want to look at the picture of the Hall of Mirrors there, it's like ridiculously decorated. There's so much going on. Everything's so ornate and intricate looking, and that's kind of what the music is supposed to sound like with all the ornaments we're going to talk about. Anyways, next slide. So in order to make everything really centralized, he had one composer that he liked a lot, which was Jean-Baptiste Lully. And he's the one that came up with not even just the orchestra idea, but having everyone use the same bowings. So organizing everyone using down bows together in an orchestra. We all hate that.
Basically choreographed so that you see the same visual.
So so everyone's doing it down. I mean, we should be able to do down bows and up bows the same, but we all know they're not the same.
Yeah. Well, especially Baroque bows.
Yeah. We can't really play with a Baroque bow.
Yeah.
Baroque bow. Anyway, but he also was the person that came up with a conductor. So prior to this, everything was just chamber music, there was no conductor, no one up there waving a stick, but he didn't wave a stick. He beat a big old tree. So he would stand up in front of the orchestra and he'd have a tree and he'd beat it on the beat. And the way he died was he was beaten along, and I guess he wasn't paying attention to where he was beating, and he stabbed his foot with the wood of the tree. And that didn't kill him, but we've all stubbed our toes. We know how bad that hurts. But he actually died because I think he got like sepsis or something. It got really, really, really infected, and then he died. Yeah. Anyways, but so other than, all of those, string sounding things, the bowings and the conducting thing, he also came up with the French overture, which was meant to, for operas, meant to welcome the king. And they sound really militaristic. They sound really triumphant and happy, but they also have themes from what's about to come. So themes from the opera, which we see in musicals, we see in operas now. Yeah, let's move it. We can play the clip a little bit. We gotta play this one from the middle, I think, because remember this one is, or do you want to play it from the beginning? Do you want to?
All right.
Sounds pretty similar to the Italians. It's a little bit more dance-y, if you can hear the accompaniment in the back.
Yeah. So now kind of getting into more of the stylistic, compositionally stylistic things that kind of make this music sound the way that it does, is we'll have notes inégales, which is a performance practice where you will dot or tripletize two equal notes to give it a lilting sound. So instead of just having, la, 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 you'll have la, 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 which creates a whole different character. If you want voice lessons, don't take them from me, but do sign up at In4Arts and take vocal lessons with some of those amazing teachers there. But I'll try not to sing too much for you guys. So the dotting kind of creates this different kind of style and character, and we'll hear a little bit of that in this next clip that I'm going to play. In addition to that, other things are some of the ornaments. So like Celaya was saying, looking at the room of mirrors, house of mirrors, place of mirrors,
Hall of mirrors.
Hall of mirrors. Looking at the hall of mirrors, you can think about all that intricate design. Well, they try to put that in music by using ornaments, so decorating the music. So instead of just having, a note be like la, they might trill it. I'm not a singer once again, but la, something like that. I could do it on cello much better, I promise. But they'll do things or la, going up and down around the note just to make it a little bit more ornamented. And lastly, we'll see more tonal organization, which we'll talk about in a second. But I'll play this clip, and then you'll kind of hear the lilting sound that we're talking about. Oh. One day I'll get good at technology.
So it wouldn't have been written that way. So the notes inégales is what we're talking about, is performance practice. So like they would see it. I mean, maybe it was written, but like what we're hearing is not what's supposed to be on the page. So.
Yeah, so what was on the page was probably da 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 da, where they're doing da dum da da dum ba dum ba dum da dum, which makes it sound like such a different character, like skipping instead of strolling. Okay, so this is what we're talking about when we're going from modal to tonal. as you can tell, I'm a little bit of a music theory nerd. So I like to kind of incorporate this stuff in. And it's important because it helps us understand why things sound the way they do. And we have Mr. Jean-Philippe Rameau, who wrote the Treatise on Harmony. And basically, we're organizing these notes in a certain way to incorporate different consonances and dissonances and creating a hierarchy there. So basically, what we're kind of moving away from is we might have heard more modes and things like that before, but now we're incorporating more like major or minor. So if you ever go, to a concert and you'll see, Beethoven's piano trio in C minor or something like that, it'll kind of usually tell you what key that's in. And different keys have different feelings and things like that. But these modes have a very different character. So we're kind of moving away from that and moving more towards this idea of major or minor. So this is just a little kind of ear training exercise. You might not be able to hear much of a difference between the two. That's okay. It starts out with a major scale and then ends with a minor scale. But in between, it'll play some different modes just so you can kind of hear different characters there. A nice backbeat. So a very different character there. A little spooky. Slightly different character. Some minor. Okay, so ear training. Yeah, so it's, you might not be able to tell, like, if you sat most musicians down in the room and played a Phrygian scale for them, or Phrygian mode, most of them wouldn't be able to go, oh, that's Phrygian. Some of them might, but usually we can really easily tell the difference between major and minor scales because that is what our Western culture of music is kind of based on at this point. So, and then from now on, it's pretty much that way. You'll get an experimental composer every once in a while, but this is where harmony really was like, hey guys, there's rules here. We got some rules. So
yeah, these modes existed, like they come from the Gregorian chants, like all the way back in the medieval, like certain chants would be in some of these modes, which is, it's not, people didn't just decide to put random combinations of notes together. I guess they just liked the major and minor ones the most.
yeah. I don't know. I'd have to read the Treatise of Harmony to know.
I think there was a Facebook poll. They were like, we like major and minor the most. Thank you. Please keep them.
Yeah. So French love to dance, like Celaya was saying. So we have, once again, form. Form is super important. Whereas before it was just kind of maybe more so free composed where there wasn't any kind of, structure to it in that way. Now we're seeing a lot more structure in the way things are written. So binary forms, you have two sections, you have the A section and then the B section. And usually a lot of the time you'll see it'll be the A section will repeat itself and then the B section will repeat itself. Once again, repetition. And then we have dances like the Allemande, Courant, Sarabande, Gigue, Rondo, Gavottes, Minuets. And you'll see these things are not only characteristics just to French music, but also other, like you'll see that in German suites or Italian suites and stuff like that. Here's a little dancing picture. Okay, so some French composers.
Yeah. The first one, she's got a lot of names. I don't know if I feel confident pronouncing all of her names, but she was the original child. There are a lot of names. Elizabeth Claude Jacquet de la Guerre. She was the original child prodigy. You know, I think something to note is that there's a lot of women in this period. Like we already talked about Barbara Strozzi, but there are way more women. I think part of that has to do with the fact that, you know, women, that art was considered like an indoor kind of activity. It was like art and culture was like really, really important to this time period. And women had a really central role in creating art during this time period. Let's see, Couperin is a French person that decided to mix the Italian with French, which is pretty cool. By using the walking bass and circle of fifth harmonic progressions that you see traditionally like in Italian music. Cool.
And now we're moving to England. So there's not a whole lot in England, but there, you know, what is happening is really important. So this is the origin of the public concerts. So we talked about in our last class how a lot of the music that was being created would happen at first mostly in the church and then eventually in the court. So we had talked some about having, you know, patronage system in place. So that's kind of how we got music in the courts. And then all of a sudden, in the Baroque era, we ended up having public concerts in the concert halls and the theaters, and you know, a place where you could really have this music available for more folks than just the ones who are like able to, you know, be friends with the higher class people in the court. So we're really seeing kind of this idea where music is more present for society overall. And Henry Purcell is one of the most important composers in England, and he utilized French opera style. There's a little clip here of Dida's Lament, and what we'll kind of harken back to is that idea of a recitative, which is more spoken, and then the chromatic ground bass. So I think the recitative part happened a little earlier, and then it turns into an aria. So this actually is where the aria starts. So let me go ahead and play a little bit of this. Yeah, so captivating. Okay, next slide.
So we talked earlier about the whole colonialism thing. So it came that was everyone just decided to travel everywhere. So Handel realized that he could make a ton of money in England. So he stayed there forever. People usually put him with England because of this, even though he's a German composer. He wrote a lot of church music. So what he's most well known for are his oratorios like Saul, and this is from Messiah. He wrote other ones that I can't remember right now. But he developed different kinds of recitatives. So there's the simple ones where it's like the voice, and then there's, you know, harmony underneath to create the mood. And then there's accompanied, which is the voice, and then there's rhythm to it. So people move based off of what the conductor is giving. So it's a little bit more of an involved version of recitative. If you want to play the clip, we all know this. I'm sure you guys all know this. Just might as well. Yeah.
And if you're a musician, you're probably, you know, professional musician, usually your musician friends will ask, oh, where, you know, who are you doing the Messiah with this year? Because it's like pretty much every year. It's just like the same with the Nutcracker. Usually we get like Nutcracker gigs and then Messiah gigs. So this is very heavily performed. Yeah, okay, so now kind of going over into Germany, we see that Italians came to Germany and brought their opera. So that was cool of them. And then internationalization. So basically, composers were kind of going all over the place and traveling and picking up ideas and music from different countries and then bringing it back to their own countries. And at this point in music history, we really see this camaraderie here of musicians that kind of are excited about all of the different styles and incorporating things from different cultures. Later on, we'll see the opposite happen where different countries will start to be like, no, we want our own brand. So this is kind of an interesting time in music history where everyone's working together and their, you know, priorities are kind of aligned in that way. And those priorities were diversity and variety of musical expression. So that was the goal there. So that's just kind of interesting to think about.
I think it's probably because people were actually able to see other composers' concerts.
Yeah.
So public concerts like weren't a thing. Like, you know, the lowly musician wouldn't be invited to the court of this blah, blah, blah lord to hear this premiere. But now, like, we can actually have premieres in public spaces.
Yeah, available to more people. Okay, so now we have a rich tradition of instrumental music.
Yeah, so instrumental music was like an active member, or it was a very present part of the church service in Lutheran culture. So before a church service, they would have some sort of prelude. This was usually performed on like the organ or other keyboard instrument. They could also perform like random sonatas. Like they could perform, you know, a Scarlatti sonata or something, or Corelli sonata in the church. So because of the organ and keyboard being so important in the church, the Germans really, really expanded on organ and keyboard music, which we'll keep seeing with, you know, Bach, Beethoven. It just keeps going down the line. If you want to go to the next slide. So going along with the whole instrumental music and organ and keyboard being important, so were the strings, and they continue to be the most important to this day. But what's particularly interesting is that they really took on the genre of the solo sonata. So this is different from solo sonata plus continuo. This has no continuo. They use it as a way to experiment different techniques on the instrument. So this is generally for string instruments. Like you can't really do a solo. I mean, people can, but in the Baroque period, there were, if you had a solo sonata, it was usually on like a violin or a cello. The first person to really do this was Heinrich Bieber, after the good old Justin Bieber. He composed the Mystery or the Rosary sonatas, which were based on the Passion. And so when I mean experiment, I mean they used things, they used chords, which before this time period, people didn't think that, oh, there's multiple strings, maybe we can play them at the same time. This is a time period where they're like, let's play them at the same time, just like a harpsichord. So the multiple strings allows stringed instruments to create their own continuo. Yeah, so let's go ahead and listen to some Rachel Podger. miss like another instrument, because it's written in a way that you have both the solo line and the continuo coming out very strongly.
Yeah. And then, so another compositional element, so we were talking about, having multiple stops. In this next clip, you'll see something that we call scordatura, and you won't necessarily notice, or you probably won't be able to hear any kind of difference, but basically what the musician will do is they'll tune down one of their strings from what it's originally intended to be tuned at to a different note. So then it changes the kind of way that your instrument is able to resonate. And then also kind of like a guitar is tuned to be in like E major. So all the strings that are on the guitar have those notes in it. The cello is tuned in fifths. So it's kind of a different tuning, but once you change that tuning, your instrument will resonate differently. There's something called sympathetic vibrations, which when you play one note on the cello, if there's another open string with that same note on the cello, if you watch it, it'll actually vibrate at the same time. So it's just another way to play around with this idea of resonance. And here we have Stephen Isserlis playing part of the fifth suite. So you might not have noticed, but the first performer that we heard, or the previous performer, was playing with a Baroque bow, was playing with more stylistic elements from the Baroque era, no vibrato, things like that. Whereas Stephen Isserlis was playing on with a more modern bow and with modern equipment and using just a little bit of vibrato here and there. So it's just kind of what a lot of the time when we're playing Baroque music, there's this argument of how should you play it? Should you play it more to be as if we were in the Baroque era with those instruments and that equipment, or should we play it as if we've lived through the time that we've lived through with our modern instruments and the knowledge and techniques that we have now? So there's this kind of argument that goes along. This brings us to Bach. So Bach was one of the most prolific composers ever to live, and like I said at the beginning, he really, really was important for pretty much all of the composers to come after him. So a lot of the time when you see people who go to universities and things like that to study composition, they'll study a bunch of Bach. He wrote the Well-Tempered Clavier. He wrote the Art of the Fugue, and just so much music, so much music. He had 20 kids, which is kind of interesting, just an interesting fact about him. But yeah, the most important thing that he wrote were the Bach suites for unaccompanied cello. So.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. I said that because I'm a cellist. That's not true. I just put that in there because it's funny. Okay, so here's a little bit of a toccata, which is more the improvisatory kind of. Okay, and then this is the same piece, just a little bit later. We'll hear the fugue part. And it just keeps going and going and going. Basically, it's just like you start with one idea, then you add that idea in again and over and over and over again. The best way to kind of explain it is this chart that we have here. And this is pretty much, we're wrapping it up here, but just kind of want to show you this visual will give us a little better understanding of the fugue. And the fugue was just such an important compositional technique that was used. It taught us a lot, and really Bach, really learned how to do the fugue so well. So you'll see here, even if you don't read music, you'll see kind of how they laid out the graph here. So if you look down and it says where it says original and you have melody, in music, let's say that's just our original melody. If we want to then invert it, so if you look to the right, it says inversion. Basically, you're flipping it upside down. So you can kind of see the contour of the music, how it's switched. When the first note went up and then the next one went down, now it's going down and then up. And then you'll see the word melody, they actually wrote upside down. There's also retrograde, which you'll see, which is basically playing it backwards. Retrograde inversion, which is backwards and upside down. Augmentation is where you make the rhythm longer, so you're kind of augmenting it out. And then diminution is where you're actually shortening the rhythm and making it like half as much, for example. And these things are kind of important to talk about just because with all that imitation and repetition that we have, frankly, if we did the same thing over and over and over and over again, it would get really boring. So they're finding different ways to be repetitive, but also kind of being sneaky about it. So it's kind of interesting to see how they're able to make that happen in music. And then this is the last slide. This is just basically showing the very important stylistic things in composers and all the things that were happening in the Baroque era versus the Classical era. So the Classical era is the one that we'll be discussing next week. So, we hope to see you there.